No matter how many times I've said it, many of you still don't believe I'm an introvert. You don't. You just don't get it. Through my adult years, I have made progress. There's a scale, introverts extreme on one end, extroverts extreme on the other end, and in between is the majority of us. So through the years, I've moved on this scale from the far end of introvertism, if that's a word, more toward the middle. But I promise you, I'm still on the introvert side of that scale. I remember the first giant steps I made away from that far end. I was a senior in high school. For a reason or reasons that I no longer remember, I decided I would try out for the senior class play. Now, you gotta realize, in class with probably about 30 people, many of them that I'd known all my years of school, I never raised my hand to ask a question. I never raised my hand to answer a question. I tried to be invisible. But for some reason, Mr. Invisible decided he wanted to be in the senior class play. And I auditioned. I got one of the roles that had a lot of time on stage. And just in case you're interested, and this explains it all, my character was the bumbling idiot. While rehearsals were going on for the senior class play, rehearsals began for another little short presentation that was going to be done in front of the student body. It was a spoof of Julius Caesar. This was going to be presented by the future teachers of America, and because I was in FTA, I was given a part in the play. I didn't audition, I didn't want it, I didn't ask for it, but the FTA sponsors, those teachers that I appreciated and admired in classrooms, said, "Here's your part." So now I got 2 plays in the spring of 1967. I didn't want anything to do with this little play. It was a constellation of bad news from the beginning. I remember vividly, the 9th grade Latin teacher was not happy that we were turning Julius Caesar into a comedy. And a musical comedy. I didn't want to be on stage in front of the entire student body, about 800 people, I suppose, and there were faculty members as well. Just didn't want to have anything to do with it. But I've got a leading role, I've got a solo. Unless you are an introvert, you cannot imagine my horror. Think of this. Introverted guy singing a solo in front of the entire student body, and some of them qualified as being rednecks, and the faculty. And it gets worse. I was Cleopatra. Complete with wig and dress. Singing a love song to a female dressed up to look like a guy. I stepped out on stage. They laughed. They hooted. They howled. I didn't even hear the piano when she gave me the introduction for my song. When the laughter finally died down, the pianist went back to the beginning, and I sang to the last row in the balcony. And then Mark Antony and I danced off stage. And as I got to the curtains in the wings, I lifted my dress and gave them a little hairy leg. Introverted, extremely. Introverts can do some daring things, but it takes a great deal of courage. This morning, I'm inviting you, I'm challenging you, including all you introverts, be bold as we continue in our transition. We're now at a pivotal point. It is incumbent upon us that we be bold. Two challenges I offer to you. First, let's be bold and embrace the future. You may not remember, but I hope that many of you do, that we adopted a slogan or a theme for 2019, and it's 4 little phrases, 8 words, and if you were ever going to memorize it, if you hadn't done it by now, you ain't going to get it done. Can you recite those 8 words? Be faithful, be loving, be bold, be Boulevard. The church council suggested that each quarter that we give emphasis to one of the phrases. And Lane Smith preached previously on the first 2 phrases. The first quarter, he preached on being faithful. The second quarter, he preached on being loving. And then this is the beginning of the third quarter. And I choose to preach on being bold. I find it extremely interesting. Here we are at the beginning of the third quarter, and next week we will welcome our new pastor. By a 98% vote on Father's Day, you and I agreed that we wanted him to be our new pastor. That was a bold vote, 98%. There were some technical issues that day that could have had some negative impact, but you were bold. And you said, I want this man to be my next pastor. He accepted our invitation. His decision was a bold one. It takes a lot of courage to leave a congregation that you love, a ministry that is rewarding, and a routine in work and family that is comfortable. Pushing all that away to move into something that is totally different among people who are, for the most part, strangers to him and them. Courage, boldness. We've seen it in recent weeks with our vote and his decision. And now next week he's coming. And that'll just be the beginning of his tenure with us. And during his tenure, we are going to be challenged to do some things that maybe we have never done before, and to do some things that we've been doing, but do them in a different way. Dear people, let me encourage all of us to be bold and to be optimistic as we welcome our new pastor. We need to embrace the future that he is going to be leading us into. It's challenging moving into the future because we never know what's going to happen. But I, one, have promised him my total cooperation. I am all for him and all for the leadership that he will give us. And I am optimistic that his leadership will prove to be very fruitful and beneficial for this church and for this community. Embracing the future. And I've got to embrace this future as I slip into retirement. Now, some of you maybe can appreciate the challenge of retiring. For some of you, it was, let's get it done. The quicker, the better. But for others of us, it's a bigger challenge than we necessarily want it to be. I say this with my grandchildren in the room, and they're absolutely going to be amazed. I can't remember when I didn't work. I've worked all my life. At the age of 9, I became a bona fide employed person. I was cutting grass for the neighbors and delivering the Greenville Piedmont in the afternoon, if any of you remember the Greenville Piedmont. 9 years of age, 2 jobs. And I have worked for the last 61 years practically non-stop. And now I'm thinking about not working. How weird is that? I think I'm going to like it. But I think I'm going to have to get used to it. But I'm going to embrace it optimistically. And if it goes sour, I'll go look for another job. Optimism is important when you're facing the future. Did you listen to the words that I read from Philippians? That brief passage just rings with optimism. Keep in mind now that the Apostle Paul was in prison. He knew there was a possibility that he would be released and he would resume his ministry. But he knew with equal reality that there was possibility that he would die in prison. He would be executed. But nonetheless, he is optimistic. And Paul says this, that with all boldness, he planned to live his life and speak his message so that Christ would always be exalted. Did you hear that? Live his life, proclaim the gospel so that Christ would always be exalted. That's a challenge that you and I need to embrace. And he went on to say to the Philippians, regardless of whether I come to you or not, live your lives in such a way that you're worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Live your lives in such a way that you're worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We need to hear that with frequency too, because that's a challenge. And so this morning, dear friends, let us be bold in embracing our future and embrace it with optimism and confidence in the grace of God. And we don't have anything to fear in the future if we will be faithful, and if we will be loving, and if we will be bold. But in order to embrace the future, we must let go of the past that can get in the way of the future. In another place in the Philippian letter, Paul says, "Forgetting what's in the past, I press on toward the goal." God had a goal for him. He knew what it was. And he was living into his future, surrendering all that was unnecessary to drag forward or to bring forward with him. That is a challenge for all of us as well. We must be willing to let go of the past, because it will complicate things for us. It will be a challenge for us if we're not living in the way that God would have us to live. I can illustrate personally, and the sermon is just about me, just know that. 10 years ago, when there was a merger, I came onto the staff in a position that was different from what I had done for 35 years. I had to let some things go. One of the things that I gave up was preaching on a weekly basis. If you've never been a preacher, you don't have any idea how that weekly cycle drives your life. But I let that go, and I was glad to let that go. And I did some other things and moved into different ways of ministry, expanding on what I'd been doing in some other ways. Well, at the end of August, I'm going to have to let the rest of it go. And unless you have been called to ministry, you don't understand that ministry is a lifestyle. It's a way of life. It's not a job. It is a way of living. And so I have got to reorient my way of living, if you please, and let go of things that I have loved doing and wouldn't have done in any other conditions other than the fact that I love doing it. So as I let go, I'm going to tell you this: you've got to help me let go. You know, we've been holding on to each other for a few years now. I'm going to let go of you. You've got to let go of me. And I share that request with you and share a story with you. My ministry began officially March 10, 1974, 45 years ago. But arranging for movers and all that other kind of stuff, we literally arrived back in South Carolina a week earlier than I was supposed to be at the church. So on March 3rd, a Sunday morning, Carmen and I decided, maybe we had already decided this, but anyhow, on that morning we got up and we went to Return Baptist Church, my new church, where the Reverend James Burris was interim pastor. And we were there for both services. I remember only this little bit of the morning sermon. Reverend Burris preached from the gospel lesson that Karen read just a few moments ago. And he gave emphasis to verse 30. He said to the church, "I am your interim pastor, but now I need to slip and fade into the background because you have a new pastor. He reminded them that Jesus' ministry and John the Baptizer's ministry overlapped, with John being the predecessor. And there came a time when there was a little confusion between John's ministry and Jesus' ministry, and John said to those who were witnesses to both of those ministries, "The time's come for me to exit. I must decrease. He who is baptizing, he who is drawing great crowds to his teaching, he must increase." And so as the end of August approaches, I'll be trying to decrease. I won't decrease enough to be Mr. Invisible, but I'm going to try my best to be Mr. Mute. I'm going to be just another church member. And I need your help to be another church member. But this is not just about me. I was teasing when I said the sermon was. Whether you have thought about it or not, in 19 months, by the end of August, you will have bid farewell to 4 full-time ministers. We're going to have a new pastor. There will be a new staff. Until there's a new staff, we have interims. You need to realize how important it is that the new pastor, the current interims, and those who will come into settled positions know that you are supporting them. And to fully support them, you got to let go of the former ministers. You have to reshape your relationships. We who have been at the heart of this church as the pastoral team need to fade into the background so that the new team can do what they need to do. You need to pledge your support to Pastor Cardy and to those who will be joining him as we move into the future. Let go. Embrace the future. Live boldly. Live optimistically. Well, I started with a little story about boldness. I'm going to end up the same way. This is not my lunch. This is not a break, by the way. Choir, you always get to see my better side, so I'll start with you. You see this? See this? It's a little box. It was given to me by a church member who is now deceased. And there's a backstory. Some of you will remember Hunter Hewitt. Hunter was a part of the Clearview congregation. Hunter might have been my biggest fan. Not that I have a whole lot. Hunter would say to me, "Pastor Jack, when you going to preach again? When you going to preach again?" And sometimes I could tell him that I had a date that I was going to preach. Johnny was going to be away, and I would preach. So on this one occasion, Hunter asked, "And Pastor Jack, when you going to preach again?" And I told him what day that was going to be, and this is what Hunter then said. "Are you going to preach in the box?" Now, some of you don't get it. Some of you have forgotten. But longer-term Boulevard people remember that Johnny preached out here. Well, you remember where Jack used to preach? Right here in this box. And so Hunter said, "Are you going to preach in the box?" And I got to thinking about that. Can I be bold enough to step out of the box? And unless you're an introvert, You have no idea how much courage it took for me to walk from there to here and get out of the box. Some of you were here that Sunday morning. Do you remember what happened when I stepped out of the box? Applause. You applauded. You have no idea what that meant to me. No idea. It gave me more courage than I can tell you. Well, a couple of days later, after that service, I got the little box from Bob Clatt. And there was a handwritten note. And this is what his note said. Let this little box remind you to keep getting out of the box. Keep stirring the pot. In other words, Bob was saying, be bold. I'm not a great fan of dust collectors, but I like this little box. And it sits in a prominent place in my home where I see it, and it is a reminder to me of the necessity of being bold. Church, we must be bold. We're facing challenging times, and you have been very bold in these 18 months of transition. But the transition isn't over. We're just moving into another phase of it. And we must be bold. The Apostle Paul said that he wanted to live boldly so that Christ would always be exalted by what he said and did. Oh God, may it ever be so for all of us. Amen.